Okay, so this week we're going to study how individual firms produce. And we'll start today by talking about production itself per unit time. So we'll basically focus only on a static way of thinking about things where sort of time doesn't enter. Everything is thought of in terms of everything per unit time. And on Thursday, we'll talk about how supply decisions are made over time. And to start things off, we're going to learn two dual ways or equivalent ways of representing the way that firms produce. One is their production technology. And thinking of things in terms of production technology makes it easy to think about decisions of when there are many different inputs and you're trying to choose which inputs are most useful in producing the output that you want to achieve. This is an intuitive way to think about information that's relevant to creating products given particular inputs. But it's going to be much less intuitive and less useful for thinking about the choices of which outputs to produce when there are many different potential outputs. The other way we'll talk about are costs of production. And this makes it easy to represent multiple outputs. And it's intuitive when you're thinking about the effect of changing the prices of different outputs. But it's more difficult to think about when you have a choice of different inputs or what you would do when the price of different inputs change. And we'll learn to link these two different representations together to one another. Okay. So let me use an example that's sort of close to home as motivation. Imagine that you're trying to get into a good college and that all colleges evaluate you based on some score S. The higher S is, the better college you get into. And you can create this score S by two things. One is extracurricular activities, which for every unit of extracurricular activities, it costs you a number of hours, TX. Or by academic work, which for every unit of academic work you produce costs you a number of hours, TA. And we'll think about two different ways of representing this problem. One is the production of this score, and therefore of college admissions, which will say how for, as a function of how much extracurriculars you do and how much academic work you do you produce output, the score for getting into college. And the reason that this is a useful way to think about things is it helps you determine how much time to spend on each of the two activities for a given amount of college that you want to get into. But another way we can think of things is the cost of being accepted, which is how much total time you'll have to spend in order to get a certain score. And this is useful for helping you to make trade-offs between whether you want to spend this amount of time on getting into college or whether you want to spend it on other aspects of your life like partying, sleeping, establishing ties with your family, etc. Okay, so let me talk about some extreme types of technology. One extreme type of technology is perfect complements. This is when the amount that you produce is the minimum of the two different aspects of your life, extracurricular activities and academics. So this is the case when schools only want people who are perfectly balanced. So they don't care about you being great at extracurricular activities if you're not at least equally good at academics and vice versa. This is an important production function in industries with many complex products. So a famous story about this was the Challenger that blew up. And apparently the reason was that there was one little O-ring that had failed in the Challenger out of tens of thousands of pieces that went into it, right? And that shows how perfectly complementary all the pieces were because they were only as strong as the weakest link, right? Okay. Another technology is perfect substitutes. Florence, What's the form of perfect substitutes technology?
You would have something like f of a x a being x plus a or some other ratio.
Exactly. So this is the case in which schools value both things according to some constant trade-off, and they really just care, that you're good overall. You could be good in academics, you could be good in extracurriculars. They, don't care which you're good at. You just overall produce things. And this is most relevant when different dimensions are fungible. So one example of this might be if I put an advertisement in the New York Times or an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal, though each one will get me some customers, right? But given that there's not that many people who overlap and read both newspapers, pretty much the amount of customers I'll get from running the ad in the two things is just additive, right? So they're perfectly substitutable ways of getting customers to come into my store. Okay. Then there is an even more extreme form of substitutes, which is called ultra substitutes, or either or production. And is Zach here? Yeah. You go by Mitch, right? Yeah. What's the form of that?
So you choose the maximum of one or the other.
Exactly. So the production function is the maximum of what you have on X and what you have on A. So this is the case where the school really only values you on your greatest strength. If you're good at academics, they don't care how good you are at extracurricular activities unless you're even better at extracurricular activities than you are at academics. And this is relevant when you can only choose one mode of production. So for example, imagine you're starting a power plant. Really, only you're going to use either coal or oil. Being a coal-fired power plant and also having some oil does no good for you, right? Only whatever you focus on is the technology you'll use, right? Now, typically this technology is not that commonly used. I don't think it showed up in your book, but it's quite relevant in many cases. And even when you don't have this very extreme form of substitution, often there can be more than perfect substitutes because you specialize in one way of doing something, and then it can become costly to use other ways of doing it. Okay. So more commonly, we're going to assume that technology has several features. First of all, that it's that it's monotonic, which means that it has free disposal. That is, no school holds it against you that you're better at something. So it might not do you any good to be better at something in some circumstances, but they're not going to actually hold it against you, right? You can always freely dispose of any ability you have in any area. The second property is convexity. And Philip, could you define convexity?
A production function is convex if and only if given 2 points that produce some production level P, any linear combination that lies between those 2 points also produces P or more.
Exactly. So this is a weak notion of sort of some amount of complementarity or preference for diversity, right? So if you had perfect substitutes, that's not convex, because the linear combination of 2 points always produces the same if those 2 points produce the same, right? Similarly, ultra substitutes is very non-convex. So it's some notion of complementarity between the different inputs. Another way of putting it is that the isoquant curves, the curves where there's the constant quantity produced by the firm, are going to point towards the origin. Under perfect complements, those isoquants look like this, so they point to the origin in a very extreme way. Under perfect substitutes, they're lines, so they don't point either way. And under ultra substitutes, or either or, they point the opposite direction. And so the assumption we're going to make is that they weakly point towards the origin. Okay. And the slope of these isoquant curves is called the marginal rate of technical substitution. And basically what convexity says is the marginal rate of technical substitution is going to get flatter as you move in this direction. Okay. How about declining marginal product? Evan, what does that mean?
Declining marginal product means it's more expensive to make the next one.
Exactly. So the first unit is cheaper than the second unit and cheaper than the third and so forth. We usually go even further than this and assume that the production function is concave in both of the inputs. Convexity and declining marginal product will imply that. And so a simple way of putting it is just that the production that you get out of each unit is concave. This can also be justified by optimization, as we'll talk about in the next lecture. And finally, we usually assume that the production technology is smooth. So there's not going to be any of these kinks like we had in these. That's so basically so we can use calculus. And you can usually approximate any non-smooth production function by one that's smooth. So the most common form that satisfies these properties is constant elasticity. Is Cobb-Douglas, which takes the form f of x and a is equal to x to some power. Here I think it's zeta, and a to some power, or I guess it's psi. No, it's psi. And then a to some power alpha. So this has a number of useful properties. One is constant elasticity of production with respect to the inputs. In particular, a p% increase in the input x for a small x will lead to a xi times, for small p, will lead to a xi times p% increase in the output. And that's constant regardless of how much of each of the goods you have. So is Julian here?
Yeah.
Yeah, Julian, can you prove that?
Let's see. So we have.
You can do it on the board if it's easier. Yeah. Yeah?
X. So that's going to be
Right?
Okay.
So that's the derivative. That's for 1 unit increase in x, but how do we make it a percentage increase in x?
Okay, right. So we need to do
So it's going to be larger the bigger x is, right?
the d log of.
Yes, you see that what you did is fine, but then you just have to multiply the derivative by x, right?
Right.
Because the bigger x is, the bigger the increase will be.
Right. Okay, so x times that. So that drops away.
And we want that to cause the same percentage increase in the output, so we need to divide it by the current output as well, right?
Right. Okay, so.
Which is just the.
Yeah, so it's just. One alpha. Okay, so then that cancels, so we just go epsilons, then we are left with just an epsilon.
Exactly. Yeah, that's actually psi. It's
Yeah,
another
yeah,
crazy
psi.
variable. But anyways, yes, that's exactly right. So what he just showed is that the percentage increase is always equal to that psi, right? Regardless of what the levels of the inputs are.
Sorry, could you explain why do you multiply by x again?
Okay, so you want an x% increase, right? That is, the larger x's, the more you want to increase, and you want it to be proportional to x, right? And so it's like a change of that proportional to x leads to a change in the output proportional to the output, right?
Thanks.
Okay. Another property is that it's homogeneous of degree psi plus alpha. In particular, if you double both of the inputs, then you will increase the output by 2 to the psi plus alpha. You get that just by factoring everything out. And that's the definition of homogeneity of degree psi plus alpha. It's also linear in its logarithm. So if we take the logarithm of both sides, we get the logarithm of the output is equal to the logarithm of k plus psi times the logarithm of x plus alpha times the logarithm of a. The marginal rate of technical substitution, that's how much we have to change the outputs relative to one another in order to stay along the isoquant. Well, that's just going to be equal to the derivative of the output with respect to a divided by the derivative of the output with respect to x, because that's the rate at which we can raise one and lower the other so as to keep the total amount constant. And that's going to be equal, by exactly this argument here, to alpha times x over psi times a, which is proportional to the ratio of x to a. So the ratio of these two is equal to the ratio of the quantities used. That implies that as we move to higher x, lower a, the slope of is going to decline of transforming x into a. Yeah.
Wait, sorry, how did you go from that last justification, like using what Julie proved to like
Yep.
show
So
how
let me just write out what he did. So he said that the derivative with respect to x is k psi x to the psi minus 1 a to the alpha. If we took the derivative with respect to alpha instead, we would have gotten k alpha psi to the, x to the psi, a to the alpha minus 1. If we now take the ratio of this to that, we get alpha x over psi a. Right? Because all the other exponents cancel out and the k cancels. Okay, so that means that the more you have of one input, the more valuable the other input is. So these properties are all very closely related to one another because linearity in logarithms is precisely what makes you have constant elasticity, because that means that one logarithmic point change always leads to the same logarithmic point change in the other. Similarly, if you have constant percentage increases, then a given unit increase is going to be less valuable the larger a given input is, and as a result you have this complementarity property. Okay. So another way of thinking about production is in terms of costs. And there are different types of costs that we discuss typically. One are variable costs, and these are ones that increase more or less continuously the more output that you have. So for example, time spent studying or practicing sports would be an example of a variable cost of producing either in the first case academic output or in the second case extracurricular activities. Then there are what are called lumpy or quasi-fixed costs. These are things that are not fixed in order to have any of the thing, but which are which as you increase output, you have to discontinuously increase this, buy a big lump of this thing in order to increase your input. Now, these are sometimes necessary in order to get your output beyond some point. Sometimes they're merely useful to do it. So for example, enrolling in a new class in school is like a lumpy input to producing academic output, right? Or taking up some new activity. It's not like you can just adjust that continuously. You have to like do a bunch more in order for it to work. Another example would be paying a tutor or buying new equipment. Now those things wouldn't be strictly necessary to increase your output, but they would be useful and they would certainly be lumpy. Yeah, Philip.
Are we assuming that you can't pay the tutor continuously by the hour? You have to buy his time in lumpy chunks.
That's the idea.
Okay.
You can't buy it by the second. Yeah, you have to buy it in lumpy chunks. Fixed costs are ones that are necessary in order to produce any of the output at all. So for example, enrolling in school. If you don't enroll in school, you're basically going to be viewed as a zero academic-wise, right? And if you don't have any current academic activities, and the only thing you want to do is like start a new club, well then starting a new club, or have your own club, then starting a new club is a big fixed cost that you need to produce any extracurricular output. And then finally there are sunk costs, which are fixed costs which you've undertaken in the past and which you can't undo at this point. And these shouldn't affect your future decisions. So for example, imagine that you have enrolled in school and you've paid your yearly tuition and now you want to withdraw and they won't give you the tuition back. Well, that's a fixed cost and you should just forget about that in making your future decisions. Okay. So costs can come from many different sources. One source is money costs. And these are probably the most intuitive and common source, like having to buy various things, like equipment, textbooks, school supplies, etc. The second is opportunity costs of time or some other resource. And this is a classic topic in economics. So for example, Benjamin Franklin famously said that time is money, in the sense that if you don't use time studying, you could use it working a job. And earn money that way, and you should never use time on something that isn't worth at least that amount of money in units of time. But this is true for other scarce resources like energy or willpower. If I exhaust myself on the playing field, I may not be able to study as well. If I work really, really hard to study, I might end up eating candy and getting overweight. Right, so there's trade-offs in terms of how you use your willpower as well. Capital costs are another important kind of cost that's not as obvious. So you can deplete a fixed resource that has some future value. And a previous problem set asked you to explore this. What it talked about was the fact that imagine you have a car, and the more you use your car, the more it gets run down. Then using your car is costly because you'll forfeit the opportunity to use your car in the future, for example. And this could be true of many things in life. So your reputation, if you use your reputation to get a job and then don't do a good enough job there, you've sort of depleted your reputation. You won't be able to use it to get a job in the future. Relationships with people. If you don't attend to your relationships with people, you won't be able to call on them when you're in need in the future, right? Your physical appearance can be like this as well. If you don't spend time attending to your physical appearance, right, you'll start to look worse and worse, or this is true of your health as well, right? Yeah.
How do you talk through Foster's success with this framework? Like for instance, Microsoft has antitrust detention for their 95% share.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah.
I mean, isn't that just an example of an opportunity cost? And that,
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, all these taxonomies are useful in some cases and not that useful in other cases. I'm trying to think, is there like a neat category into which that falls? I mean, you can always call things just direct costs, right? But I'm not sure that there's any of these categories into which it particularly naturally fits. Yeah, Christian?
It almost becomes like a tax, like if you get to a certain level of success in the government.
That's right, but that's not in any of these categories. I mean, a tax is really just another form of cost. But yes, it's a cost imposed by the government. Okay, so costs are a useful way to think about things relative to the technological way of talking about things we were discussing before in terms of production technology, because it can help you think about how much to produce. So for example, like when you're making the trade-off between going to college, getting into college, and making other goals in your life, you want to know how much time you're going to have to put in to achieve a certain amount of college, so you can think about how valuable getting into certain colleges relative to other things I could do. And this is easy to graph, as we'll see shortly. And this is the context in which we'll usually think about these things when firms are choosing how much to produce, not what things to use to produce. It helps determine prices because it has a very natural interface with product markets. Because it'll say, how much do firms produce as a function of price? We can then use that to figure out how much the price has to be in order to get firms to produce what's demanded in the market. So for example, if we want to determine what score you need to get into any given school, we need to aggregate across students how much they're all going to be working and compare that to how many places the schools have, right? Because that'll tell you what the threshold will be for getting into a given school. So to find that equilibrium, we need to think about things in terms of how much would it cost students in order to get into a given school, and then we can use how much they value getting into a given school to determine, for a given set of thresholds, how hard people work, and then given the amount of places that are available, what threshold will that lead to an equilibrium. Now this is difficult using technology. If we had to derive that all directly from like how extracurricular and academics fit into all of this, it would be a bunch of additional steps that usually are not useful if that's the exercise we're thinking about. But if we're thinking about exactly how do you get into a school, well then that will be really useful. So depending on what problems we're thinking about, we'll use one or the other way of analyzing them. Okay. And with fancier math that we won't go through today, it's actually pretty straightforward to think about costs of producing multiple different outputs, not just a single output. Okay. Nonetheless, these two concepts are equivalent, or what economists call dual to one another. And we can mathematically derive one from the other. So this is particularly easy to see if we have only one input with a price pi, let's say. Well, then we can just ask, if we want to produce a given amount of output O and the production function is I to the gamma, well then we can just invert this and say, well that means that we're going to need an amount of the input equal to O to the 1 over gamma in order to produce it, and then just multiply that by the price of that input to determine the cost of production. Right? Now when there are multiple inputs, there are two steps. First, you have to find the cheapest way of producing for a given output, and we call this the cost of the output. So first we find the cheapest way of producing. Then we calculate at that cheapest way of producing what is the cost of producing a given output, and that becomes the cost, right? And this is particularly easy to do for some of the extreme technologies that we considered above. So for example, Kim, for the perfect complements technology, what is the cost function? Don't look at your slide. How much does it cost to produce output O if we have a perfect complements technology? But just think about it intuitively, right? Remember what happens. Imagine you need to get score S. You want to achieve score S. And we know that the school is going to rate you on the worst of your two abilities. You have to be equally good on the two things. what is it going to cost you in terms of time to get a score S in that case?
Minimum function?
What?
Minimum?
Well, no. So, I mean, just intuitively think about it. If they're going to grade you on the worst of the two things, what is the best strategy for you to take? It's going to be to produce equal amounts of those two things, right? Because anything else would be a waste. And how much are you going to have to produce in order to get the score S if they grade you on the minimum of the two things that you do? Well, you're just going to have to produce the amount that they say, right? The score S, right? You're going to have to do that on both of the two dimensions, because otherwise you're not going to achieve their desired score level, right? And so you have to sum together the time that it takes you to achieve that score on both of the dimensions. So it's just the sum of the two time costs multiplied by the score you need to achieve, right? Okay. Now, how about if the two things are independent or perfectly substitutable? Philip, what would the cost function look like then?
It would be, you would take the cheapest that you could produce and produce enough of it to get the desired score. So it would be S minimum TX TA.
Exactly. So you'd choose which thing you were best at, which thing was cheapest for you, and then you would do everything that way and nothing the other way, because it would be more costly to do it the other way, right? And that's the same with the either or extreme complements technology. Okay, so now let's consider the Cobb. Rishi. Yeah. Because that's the amount you want to produce, right? You want to produce S, and in order to do that, you need to take whatever the cost of producing one unit is.
What is just the individual?
Yeah. Okay. So now let's consider Cobb-Douglas in the two-input case. We want to figure out what is the cheapest way of us producing S, right? Which is the arg minimum of the cost, which is the amount of X we produce times the amount of time cost of that, plus the amount of A we produce times the time cost of A, subject to producing at least S, right? This is sort of the most classic constrained minimization problem, and I want to review the sort of economic approach to this problem. Now, the way that economists think about these things is we come up with a notion of an opportunity cost of failing to produce, right? We need to produce this amount, and so we want to figure out what is the opportunity cost of failing to produce. That's really going to be the cost of production, right? Or the marginal cost of production, right? And then we'll minimize the total cost, including the opportunity cost of failing to produce, right? And this opportunity cost is called the Lagrange multiplier, right? But I'm going to just call it an opportunity cost from now on to emphasize the economic interpretation of what it is. So then we're going to solve for the opportunity cost, and this will allow us to derive the marginal cost that we were interested in. Okay. So let me just go through that problem mathematically. Is there an eraser? There, let's see one. Guess not. That's strange. What? What?
Eraser.
You have to chalk.
Eraser.
Where's the eraser? You see an eraser? No? Just a chalk. It's not that useful without an eraser.
Steal one from another room.
Yeah, can someone go find an eraser in another room? Thanks, Kim. That's really strange. Never had it fit an eraser in.
while we're waiting for,
Yeah.
can you explain like what the opportunity cost is of like not producing? I'm having trouble like understanding.
So the point is, like, if I fail, okay, so I can spend no more than 24 hours in a day. And so therefore we say there's an opportunity cost of my time. What creates the opportunity cost is that I'm limited to 24 hours. If I spend one more hour doing something, I have to spend one less hour doing something else. You can reverse that around. You can say, if I have to produce at least this much, then there's a cost if I fail to meet this quota. It's really just like the reverse of the exact same idea. And so all that a Lagrange multiplier is an opportunity cost. It's nothing more and nothing less than that. So when you use Lagrange multipliers, all that is doing is mathematically formalizing the idea of opportunity costs that you're used to talking about intuitively in economics. I don't know if has anyone made that link for you guys before? I mean, that's really all it is. Like, whenever you do constrained optimization, whenever you do these Lagrange multiplier things, the only reason in economics we use that is it's a mathematical symbol that represents the idea of an opportunity cost. And when you solve out for the Lagrange multiplier, all you're doing is solving for the opportunity cost. So the economic way of, all this constrained optimization stuff, it's just a way of formalizing in mathematics, or really just writing down literally the notion of an opportunity cost so that you can solve it. And then all you're doing when you solve the Lagrangian problem, the reason you have that Lagrange multiplier up there multiplying everything is you're minimizing your total costs, including the opportunity costs. Right? And that's why it has that weird form that always seems inexplicable, where you write up the cost plus some random number multiplied by something else. That's because your opportunity cost multiplies all your uses of those scarce resources. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Just to be clear, so when we think of the utility maximization,
Yeah.
and so lambda would be marginal utility of income.
Yep.
So how would you go around explaining the economic intuition behind that opportunity cost?
So the point is that, like, now we're thinking of maximizing your utility, right? And there's going to be an opportunity cost in utility terms of using money, right?
They don't have extra.
Okay, well, I give up.
I'll go get some paper towel from the back.
Okay.
Will that work?
Yeah, hopefully. As long as you wet it, yeah, it should work, I guess. And then have some dry ones, too, to dry it. This is so stupid. I can't believe it. Yeah, so, like, there's an opportunity cost in units of utility of using your money, because you only have so much money, right? So, like, I know we usually think of money as being like the unit in which things are denominated, but if we're thinking of things in utility terms, right, then money is a scarce resource, and there's an opportunity cost of your money, which is you could get other utility for that money, right? Yeah.
So that's why last year the land was the marginal utility income, so it's just, that's basically the same thing.
Yeah, because of course you have to set every use of money equal to its opportunity cost, which is the marginal benefit that it has for you. Right? So the marginal benefit of having an extra unit of time is the opportunity cost of time, because you set all uses of time equal to the marginal benefit of having additional time. Right? Yeah, can you erase that one? So silly. Not you.
At least it's a good example of complements in action.
Yeah. Exactly. Without the dry towel, the wet towel is much less valuable because you have to wait for the board to dry then. Okay, we're going to solve this baby. Okay, so, thank you. So, what we're going to do is we're going to minimize total costs, including opportunity costs of failing to produce, right? So we're going to minimize TXX plus TAA plus the opportunity cost of failing to produce. What's that? lambda, the opportunity cost, multiplied by the amount that we fall short of what we were supposed to be producing, right? So we're supposed to be producing S. The amount by which we fall short of S is K x to the psi a to the alpha minus S, right? Is that right? No, I think it's the other way around. Oh God, but I can't erase. Okay, just switch those in your mind, guys.
Or put a minus next to lambda.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take the derivative of that, right? So the direct cost of x minus is equal to lambda k x to the c minus 1, c out front, a to the alpha. So what is this equation saying? It's saying that the cost of producing x has to be equal to the opportunity cost of failing to produce x, which is the marginal product of x multiplied by the opportunity cost of failing to produce. That's all that equation says. You should always, anytime you write down an equation, you should be able to say out what the equation says in words. Otherwise, you're letting the math run you rather than you run the math, okay? And similarly, the cost of producing A is equal to lambda times k alpha x to the c a to the alpha minus 1. So then we can solve out for what the opportunity cost has to be by setting these two lambdas equal to each other, moving all this stuff to the other side of the equation. So we get tx over k c x to the c minus 1 a to the alpha is equal to ta over k c x to the c a to the alpha minus 1, put an alpha there. Okay, so these k's are going to cancel, right? And this stuff basically cancels except that we get an x up there and an alpha up there. And that gives us that x over alpha, it should be equal to ta alpha, sorry, ta psi over tx alpha. So that says we use the ratio of x to alpha we choose is equal to the cost of A over the cost of x. Obviously, we're going to use more x if A is more costly. Times the ratio of how productive x is, c over how productive alpha is. Yeah.
Is this supposed to be x over a? Or
X over A. Okay, so then what we know is that we need to satisfy this constraint. We need to produce at least S. So then we can substitute this condition back into here. So we get that K times A to the alpha times, well, X is just A multiplied by this thing here. So that's going to be A to the psi times TA psi over Tx alpha to the alpha, and that's equal to S, right? And that gives us that A is equal to S over K to the 1 over alpha. Times this guy to the power alpha over, alpha plus psi. Alpha plus psi. Yeah.
Is that K, A to the alpha, A to the C? On the,
Yeah.
okay.
Because I substituted in the fact that x is equal to this guy times A. And then you can substitute that in and solve back out for x. Okay. But the most important things that we learn from this are first the classic productive efficiency conditions. So what we got here was that the ratio of how productive the two things is equal to the ratio of their prices, right? And that's the most fundamental condition for the efficiency of production. And this is also, as you guys have probably seen before in class, the tangency condition. So remember we have these isoquants, and then we have, like, the ratio of the prices is represented by this tangency point, that the ratio of the prices is equal to the marginal rate of transformation is exactly that the prices lie tangent to the isoquants. The Lagrange multipliers are just the marginal opportunity cost of failing to produce, right? And when we solve out for lambda, we also solve out for the marginal cost of production immediately, right? And finally, we get the Cobb-Douglas formula, which once you plug everything in, is that the cost is equal to psi plus alpha times this mess here. Okay. And the optimal factor proportions are proportional to productivity and inversely proportional to the costs. Okay. Now, mostly, we're going to consider these cost curves not in terms of totals, but in terms of per unit. And there are a few different relevant per unit quantities. One is the marginal cost of production, which is the derivative of the cost function, and which we'll denote by MC. Second is average cost, which is cost per unit on average. And sometimes these are decomposed into two different parts, into average fixed cost and average variable cost. So the average fixed cost is, of course, the fixed cost divided by the output, and the average variable cost is the variable cost divided by the output. Yeah?
If there are quasi-fixed costs present, would you classify them as part of fixed costs for this?
We're never going to do that in this class. So you can just sort of ignore it, basically. These are pretty much this whole lecture is stuff that I'm like sort of have to teach you, and that doesn't interest me all that much. So I tried to at least teach you something about what a Lagrange multiplier is, so you understand it better. That's about the only thing that I think is interesting in this lecture. But I'll show you some like empirical examples of cost curves, which maybe will be slightly more interesting. I mean, this stuff is like useful to like intuitively think through, like, you know, applications, but it's not an application itself. So, yeah, Austin.
It's kind of an odd question, but I know I remember reading, like, in command economies, they were, towards the end of, like, the Soviet era, they started using computers to try to generate, like, production functions. Was it this sort of math, or was it...
It was much more complicated versions of the same idea. Look, the basic idea, as we'll learn, behind the whole market economy is the same as the basic idea behind this. Like, basically, you can view the whole economy as one big old optimization problem, and all that prices are opportunity costs. So as we'll learn later, basically all that an opportunity, like there really is no fundamental difference between socialism and capitalism. It's just how they do the computations of what's optimal, right? That's the only difference between them. Prices in a market economy are just how much does it cost other people that you use that resource. That's what you have to pay for it. Because somebody else would have been willing to buy it at that price if you didn't buy it. And so you should have to pay the opportunity cost of you using that resource, right? From the perspective of society. So from a communist perspective, there's these opportunity costs that a computer solves out for. From a capitalist perspective, they're called prices, but they're exactly the same thing. Okay. This is a good story. Okay, so average costs. Okay, so average cost is the cost divided by the output. So if we take the derivative of that, we get the derivative of the top times the bottom minus the derivative of the bottom times the top. Right? That's the derivative of total cost times the output minus total cost. Right? Which gives you this. But we know that the derivative of total cost is just marginal cost, and that the total cost divided by output is equal to average cost. So we get that the derivative of average cost is equal to marginal cost minus average cost over the output. Now that says that the the average cost will be rising whenever the marginal cost is above the average cost. And it will be falling whenever the marginal cost is below the average cost. So the way I like to think about this is in terms of test scores. If you got above the average of the test, you know that the average is higher than what it would have been had you not been included. Right? Does that make sense? Okay, so this is related to how I met my wife. So freshman year in Latin American politics class, the professor came back at the midterm, and it was mostly an upper class. There was 80% third and fourth years. There were only 5 first years in the class out of like about 80 people or something like that. And he said, I was really amazed. Of all the classes, the freshmen did the best. And on the midterm exam. Now, on this exam, there were 5 freshmen. I was one of them. There were 3 other girls who were coming to me for help on the exam, so I was pretty confident that they hadn't done well enough to, given that it was like sort of Latin American politics class. You can't like curve bust in a Latin American politics class, right? And you can only get an A. There's no A plus 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 plus, right? So I knew I wasn't enough to outweigh the 3 of them and to make our average above the upperclassmen. So I know that the 5th freshman, who became my wife, had to have done really, really well on the exam, and that was why I decided to start hitting on her. So you can tell something both about my taste in women, the fact that she became a Latin American politics graduate student, and the fact that I became a mathematical economist. So it speaks to a lot of things about us. Okay, so the total cost is a curve that we rarely draw, but it can be decomposed, of course, into the fixed and variable components, just like the average cost curves. Okay, so you guys have probably seen these curves before. But a typical shape will be that there's like some fixed cost, and the average fixed cost, because it's just fixed, it just dies off like a 1 over the output. So this is the average fixed cost. The variable costs, so the marginal cost often is assumed to be initially decreasing and then increasing. The variable cost, the average variable cost, is going to follow the marginal cost but more slowly, right, by the logic we just did. So they start out together, but now this is below it, it sort of follows it. But now this starts to come back up, and then this starts increasing again, and it sort of follows it up. And then the average total cost is the sum of these two. So, oops, it's always above this. Yeah, it looks something like that. So the key thing is that the average costs always intersect the marginal cost at their minimum, right? Because when it's below it, it's falling, and when it's above it, it's rising. Okay, so let me give you some empirical examples of cost curves. So one cool one comes from a paper by Susan Athey and Denis Nikiforov, who study online search ad auctions. So these are auctions where bidders offer a price that they're willing to pay per click for a word like car insurance. So if you want your website to show up on Google whenever someone searches for car insurance, you might enter a bid. And they usually submit these bids and maybe change them once every week or two. And they win slots based on a score that comes from the search engine, because the search engine basically says, how likely do I think this ad is going to be to get clicked on? They learn that based on a machine learning algorithm. They look at how much people have clicked on in the past, etc. And you get a score, which says how likely is your ad to be clicked on. You say, how much am I willing to pay per click? And then Amazon assigns you a spot based on what's going to generate the most revenue for them, right? And what you have to pay is how high you would have had to have bid in order to get into the slot that you get. So they're going to give the first slot to the one who's going to generate the most total revenue, second to the person who gets the second, etc. And then they say, how much would you have to have bid in order to stay in your slot rather than get knocked down to the next slot? That's what you end up paying. Okay. So if you are in a higher slot, right, then you're going to get more clicks, most likely, right? Because more people click more on the top slots. So you can think of yourself not as choosing a price to bid, but instead choosing how many clicks I'm going to get on average, right? Because there's like a one-to-one relationship between those things. The higher I bid, the more higher slot I'm likely to get, and therefore the more clicks I'm likely to get. So you can think of me just choosing how many clicks on average do I want to get, right? So there's like a cost of clicks curve that's derived from how much competition you face in the auction, what your score is, all that sort of stuff, right? So we can derive both the average cost of clicks and a marginal cost of clicks from that curve, right? If I want to have one more click in expectation, how much is it going to cost me? Well, I'm going to have to bid enough so that I would get, et cetera, right? And you can use this to derive optimal bids, and this is exactly what Athey and Nikiforov did using the Microsoft data. So first, they found the average cost of clicks by just saying, okay, if I want to get this many clicks on average, here's how much I'm going to have. If I want to get this many clicks on average, here's how much I'm going to have to pay for those, right? And then you can derive from that a marginal cost of clicks. And then the company can say, well, here's how much I value getting a click, and that gives them the optimal clicks to get. Makes a lot of sense, no? And the thing I liked a lot about this is if you looked at the problem the other way, if you just said, how much should I bid? That seems like a really complicated problem. It sounds like auction theory, whatever. But if you say, no, here's how much it's going to cost me to get a certain number of clicks, right? That's easy to figure out just using some basic data. And then you can derive from that the marginal cost just through their relationship to each other. And then it's easy to figure out how much you want to bid.
Wait,
Yeah.
The value is the yellow line?
Yeah. Okay. So another example of sort of like a complicated problem that can be quite simply understood by by thinking about things in terms of cost is the cost to the government of providing insurance. So imagine we have just one insurance provider. So it could be the government, or it could be like, I'm an employer, and I'm going to figure out how many of my employees I'm going to cover by changing around the premium that it costs to get coverage, right? If I have a really low premium, everyone's going to get coverage. If I have a really high premium, no one's going to get coverage, right? So by moving around that premium, or under Obamacare, moving around the subsidies, you can figure out how many people will get covered, right? And so the quantity there is the fraction of the population that gets covered in insurance, right? So as it lowers its price, more people will sign up for coverage. Now, if everyone had the same cost of being covered, this would just be a totally linear cost, constant marginal cost. But different people typically have different costs of being covered, right? The typical story is that the people who are going to most want coverage, who will be willing to buy it even when it's very expensive, are the really unhealthy people, right? And that people who will be willing to buy it even when it's less expensive, who will be willing to buy it only when it's less expensive, are going to be the healthier people, right? That's called adverse selection, or the lemons problem. So you can understand the adverse selection problem. I don't know if you guys have ever heard about this, but it's usually, this sort of exotic thing about asymmetric information. You can understand it completely in terms of the cost curve faced by the government for providing insurance. The oldest story where this first came up, this idea of adverse selection, was called Gresham's Law. Does anyone know what Gresham's Law is? So Gresham's Law was the idea that bad money drives out good money. So if there's, imagine that there's non-gold money and there's gold money, and people know that the gold money is really worth more than the non-gold money is, but you're legally required to treat them the same. Then everyone will hoard the gold money and use the non-gold money. And that's very similar to the idea of what happens under adverse selection, right? If you're forced to treat, because you don't know the difference, say, sick people and healthy people the same, all the bad money, the unhealthy people, will come and try to get insurance, and all the healthy people will try not to get insurance, right? However, it's possible that we could get the opposite thing happening. It could be that the people who really want insurance are not the sick people, but the people who are hypochondriacs, right? Because they're really afraid they're going to get sick. And those people also take really good care of their health, right? Because they're worried about getting sick. If that's the case, you might get the opposite relationship, where actually the people most eager to buy insurance are the least costly. In that case, the cost curve will slope up, because the people who come in late to the market, who only come in when there's a lot of people in the market, will be the people who are really healthy. Really sick, not the people who are healthier. This is called advantageous selection. We're going to return to the policy implications of this in some later lecture, possibly lecture 12, possibly lecture 10 actually, but because I forgot to change this on the slide. There was a nice paper by Laurent Aynave and Amy Finkelstein and Mark Cullen that estimated this. So what they considered is they looked at a very large company that was offering insurance, and different managers in different divisions offered this insurance for different prices. And what they looked at was, and they assumed that this was randomly assigned, that basically the different managers basically had similar workers, but they were randomly choosing different prices. Whether that's true or not, who knows? But as a result, these people were getting different numbers of people being insured, and this gave them estimates of the cost curve. So here's what they got. Here were the different prices that were charged. And the white dots indicate how many people bought insurance at the different prices. And as you see, it sort of looks like a demand curve. As you increase the price, fewer people buy insurance, right? Then you can ask, okay, these different people bought insurance. What was the average cost that was spent on covering these people who bought insurance, right? You can just look at that in the claims data for the insurance companies, right? You can just look at how much on average they cost when these different things were assigned, and that gives you this average cost curve. And from that you can derive a marginal cost curve. Now, there's a notion that adverse selection can cause there to be too little insurance in the market, and the reason is that the company usually prices these plans at their average cost. but it's socially optimal instead to price at the marginal cost, where that equals demand. And that creates this distortion here that we'll talk about later. Okay. So, an important thing to note is that neither of these cost curves looks like those standard shapes of cost curves that I drew out there, right? So while those types of cost curves correspond to a certain story, in the real world, many cost curves look different depending on the types of application you're looking at. So the standard story that generates these cost curves is that there's some fixed cost, but then there's decreasing returns. Typically because the company has only a certain amount of entrepreneurial talent to run it, and that as you get larger, that talent is spread thinner over more production. So let's consider the Cobb-Douglas example. Imagine that we have costs which are some fixed costs plus some Cobb-Douglas costs. Now I've gotten rid of all those messy coefficients and have just collapsed it to some number multiplied by the score you try to produce to some power gamma, right? So then the average fixed cost, right, is just the fixed cost divided by S. The average variable cost is that variable cost, the second component, divided by S. The average total cost is adding those two things up, and the marginal cost is the derivative given over there. So we can do comparative statics on this using Mathematica. Am I going to try to put you guys through that? Let me see. Well, so this is what you get if f is equal to 1, if kappa is equal to 1, if gamma is equal to 1.5. So you get this sort of characteristic shape. The marginal cost is going up. The average cost is, average variable cost is going up. But the average total cost has this downward shape and then comes back up because the average fixed cost is being deferred. Let me see if I can figure this out. Yeah.
A question about the way the Cobb-Douglas function set up.
Yeah.
Last year we were always told that the alpha and S were always going to add up to 1. So.
Yeah, but that's only if there's constant returns to scale. But I'm explicitly here assuming that there's decreasing returns to scale, because that's how you get the forms that sort of the standard ways of here we go. Yeah, we would have gotten like a linear thing there. Actually, we can play around with this if you want. Here we go. So this is Mathematica. I'm just putting into it all the things that we just had, right? And here are the parameter values. And here we get a graph. So here I've assumed that gamma is equal to 0.6, right? In that case, we have increasing returns to scale, so all these cost functions are going down. If now I increase gamma to 1, what your suggestion, right? When we have constant returns to scale, we can now draw the things, and you see we have now linear costs, and so the marginal cost and average variable cost are completely flat, right? And that doesn't lead to the characteristic shape, because we just get this like leveling off. But if I make gamma higher, so that those things don't sum to less than 1, right? Then we get the characteristic shape. And as I make gamma even higher, we get more decreasing returns to scale. And this gets even more extreme. In fact, if gamma gets above 2, then actually the marginal costs are convex. If we increase the fixed cost, on the other hand, that's going to make the point at which we reach a minimum of the average total cost curve be further out, because there's more fixed costs to get rid of, to sort of like amortize before you get overwhelmed by the marginal cost. So that's the sort of thing you can play around with using this. I can post this code if you guys want it. Just send me an email and I'll post it. Okay. Mathematics is very straightforward. You literally just enter in everything you want, and then you can play around with it. Okay, let me just see where I am. Okay, good. We're in exactly the right place. So the standard assumption is that average cost declines first and then increases for the reasons I just said. Now, declining average cost is called economies of scale. And why is it called? What are some of the reasons, Joan, that are given for there being economies of scale usually?
For example, if you have economies of scale, you might need some factory production, and you can expand the easier, or you should produce more.
Yeah.
Because it's hard to get that capital when you're small, but if you're larger, you
Yeah.
can produce more.
Yeah, that's a good idea. It's like there might be certain things that you need that are fixed, but that once you have those, you can produce a lot, right? An example I like to give of this is there's a restaurant in the outskirts of Bogota. Actually, they now have one in downtown Bogota, Colombia, called Andres Carnes de Res. Andres Carnes de Res is sort of a giant shit show. It's like this crazy restaurant for like 10,000 people, basically. And they have like giant daycare center there. They've got like, dancing for young people. They've got, like a playground for like, kids, all this whole thing, right? Why are they able to do that? Well, if a normal restaurant can't do that because they only have a small number of people, and it costs a lot to build each one of those facilities. But if you've got a huge number of people coming to your restaurant, right, you can amortize those fixed costs over a large number of people, and it makes sense to do it, right? So that's sort of Joan's example, right? You can attract these people, but you have to have enough people to make it worth having all those facilities. Yeah, Austin. Yeah. Another reason is that you can specialize when you have a larger facility. So rather than having one person do lots of different things, people can focus on something and get very good at that. And that's Smith's pin factory example. I don't know if you've ever read The Wealth of Nations, but there he talks about how in the pin factory, each person does one thing and they get very good at that one thing. And in particular, they're not constantly changing between different things, so they don't waste time in the transition. And that's like the principle on which assembly lines are basically built, right? Another reason can be economies of scale over time, where by doing something for a while, you can get better and better at doing it. And I'll show you an empirical example of that in just a moment. A third case is a final case is network effects. So it may be that just because the consumers like interacting with lots of other consumers, that it's cheaper to supply a service to many consumers than to few. So Facebook's a classic example of that, right? Like having 1 million different Facebooks providing equal quality service would be very, very hard because consumers like being able to interact with everybody, right? So if you slice Facebook up, it's much more expensive to provide a service of the equal quality. And a final example is adverse selection, as we just talked about, right? It's actually cheaper to provide insurance to the whole population than to provide it to a small part of the population because you don't get everybody into the market because the healthy people stay out of the market unless you're covering everybody. Right? Increasing marginal cost is called diseconomies of scale. And Christian, what might be some reasons for diseconomies of scale?
Well, not all of your inputs will scale up at the same rate. So, for example, if I think in the book it talked about the farmers on the same amount of land. Mm-hmm. So you could increase the amount of farmers, but if you have the same amount of land, eventually they're not going to be able to. Each farmer is not going to.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
There's also one entrepreneur, so entrepreneurial talent.
Yeah.
Will stay constant even as you increase operations.
That's right. So a classic example of this is restaurants. I don't know if you've noticed, but like most restaurants, they could start out being really good, and then they try to like build another location, and suddenly the quality starts going down because like what was making them so good was that they had a chef that was like really, really good and keeping things going. But if he's now getting spread thin over all these restaurants, the quality starts going down. Another reason, yeah, Evan.
Should it be increasing average costs?
Yes, that's true. That's right. That's right. That's right. Now, of course, you could try to hire other people, right, to run the company. But if you don't trust the people or they're not acting in your interest for the reasons that we were talking about last lecture, that becomes hard. So in particular, in developing countries, where it's much harder to enforce contracts, it's much harder to trust people, it's much harder to keep people from stealing, companies tend to be quite small because they can't find people to delegate to who they trust. Another reason might be market power. So you remember that internet auction thing we saw. The question is, why doesn't it just cost a constant amount more to get additional clicks? And the reason is, as you try to buy more clicks, now you're the one who's really setting the price, right? Because you're having to bid higher in order to get it. Whereas before, as you were bidding higher for clicks, it was basically other people's demand that was setting the price. And that's one reason why you had that increasing marginal cost in that graph and average cost. Yeah?
Doesn't market power a lot of times also cause economies of scale? These will have to increase.
So no, actually, market power might be caused by economies of scale, but the reason it requires economies of scale to cause it is that it itself leads to diseconomies of scale. You see what I mean? Yeah, Philip.
This market power is also equivalent, let's say, to a diseconomies of scale for education in an area, because if you make too many schools, you start to tap out the reserve of available teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Nonetheless, I think the most common thing is constant returns to scale, because it's often possible to replicate anything you can do in a small area. You can sort of do the same thing in some sense more broadly. In particular, if you really want to expand something broadly, you usually have to replicate the fixed costs that you had. So it might be true that, for Andres Carnes de Reis, that, in order to get efficient scale, they needed to have that. But if they wanted to build another Andres Carnes de Reis, it's not like they could just share the same dance floor with that other, place. And even if they wanted to make it much bigger, at some point the dance floor would get crowded and they'd have to build a second dance floor, right? Okay. So here's an example from data of economies of scale over time, in particular learning by doing. So this is from a paper by Lanier Bencard, and this shows the cost in man-hours to produce an airplane after they had produced so many units, right? And this shows, and this here shows how much they were producing any given year. So what's happening is they're going down this, what's called learning curve, because they've produced more and more and they're getting better at producing. But then they get a reduction in their orders and their costs go back up because they actually forget a little bit of what they learned. And then once their orders go back up again, then their costs comes down again. Okay. So, yeah, Evan.
I was just wondering, could that cost also be explained rather than forgetting, just by it becomes so expensive to create so many additional units, they have to learn new methods to bring down?
Well, I think it's particularly indicative that you see that when their volume goes down, then their costs go back up. You see what I mean? It's not just in general that it goes up, but it's precisely at the moment when their volume goes down that their costs go back up again. Yeah.
Is that because people leave because the institute they don't have enough work, so they're not getting their credits?
Yeah, they probably have to fire a lot of the people, or there's just turnover in the business, and the new people are not getting trained as much. Okay. Now you can measure economies of scale by something called the elasticity of scale, which is the ratio of average to marginal cost. If this is greater than 1, you have economies of scale, and if it's less than 1, you have diseconomies of scale. And this is a generalization of the notion of homogeneity of degree k, because the elasticity of scale, when you have homogeneity, is equal to k. Okay. So when this is basically comes from the fact that the elasticity of because something which is homogeneous has constant elasticity by the exact same argument we were giving earlier. When there are multiple outputs, we often talk about economies of scope. So this is things that are cheaper to produce together than to produce separately. So one reason for economies of scope is that there can be common inputs. So for example, Walmart finds it cheaper to have all of the goods sold together rather than to have other companies that would sell them separately, because they can have one truck bring all the stuff in, right? And so that makes it cheaper for them to sell the things together than to sell them separately. Another reason can be byproducts. So for example, crop rotations are very popular. It's cheaper to produce 2 different crops on alternating years than to produce the same crop over and over again, because what one crop takes out of the soil, another crop can put back into it. Another example is agglomeration in cities. So cities bring together lots of different types of production because it can benefit someone in the tech industry to have people from finance around, because they can provide finance for the tech industry. You see what I mean? So having those things together can be valuable because they feed off of one another. But there can also be diseconomies of scope, and I think a good example of that is when there could be clashing cultures between the production of different things. So in Peru, Indecopi is their antitrust and intellectual property regulator. But the cultures of antitrust and intellectual property are very different from one another. Intellectual property is like a service to the business, whereas competition policy tends to try to serve consumers and crack down on businesses that are being abusive. And having those two people around can reduce each of their productivity because it can undermine their morale and confuse them about what they're trying to accomplish. Okay, thanks guys. Sorry about the mess ups.